Hello. I think everyone is funneling into the virtual audience. The seats are filling up. Everyone is suitably 2 meters apart and stating their personal preferences en masse. So let me begin and welcome you all today. This is the first of a series of webinars we're doing, which looks locally to tell the national story about what's happening with the housing emergency in our country. So today we are in the West Midlands, and we're going to be looking at exactly what it has meant across the West Midlands to be facing the different issues that are there when there is increasingly from poor quality, insecure private rentals to temporary accommodation too far from schools. There's many children, far too many children in West Midlands growing up without a home that's safe and secure. We're going to talk a little bit about that problem, but we're also going to say determinedly that that corner can be turned if we're all willing to be part of the fight to do so. So our first session is today is going to explore what social housing means to families, children, and to the wider community of the West Midlands. I do hope you'll be staying with us for the next of our virtual tour that we'll be doing. Tomorrow we'll be down in London speaking with Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor for Housing. And a couple of weeks after that, we'll be going up to Greater Manchester to hear from the Mayor there, Andy Burnham, as well as other people involved in the region tackling the housing emergency. I should say I'm Alastair Harper. I'm Head of Public Affairs at Shelter, and my job here is simply to chair the conversation. So I must stop wittering. I've already done too much because we have a great bunch of individuals and experts here to actually lead the conversation. We have Shaun Bailey MP. He was elected to West Bromwich West in 2019. He's a great vocal supporter of investment in social housing, a tenure he grew up in himself. And as a backbench Conservative MP, it's important to distinguish he's there pushing for his constituents on the backbenches, but while he's a member of the governing party, he isn't part of the government himself. So the levers are something he needs to join us in shouting to be pulled rather than have his hand on them themselves. Hopefully that will change in a reshuffle or two. And then next we have Vicky Hines. She is Shelter Sub-Manager for Birmingham, the wider area, and has worked at Shelter for approximately a decade. Prior to that, worked for Wolverhampton City Council for 16 years. Her job day to day is overseeing the hub, all the work that we do, her team dealing with the front line of poor housing and homelessness right across the West Midlands, and seeing what it means for people to be impacted because of that lack of good quality, secure social housing. And finally, I'm delighted that we have Claire Evans with us. And Claire is the Deputy Head at Anderton Park Primary in the Spark Hill area of Birmingham. She's worked there for 15 years. And at that school, 45% of children attending Claire's school are currently in receipt of free school meals. That's more than double the national average. So Claire leads the pastoral team and works daily with families who are at risk of being homeless and who are made homeless in the school. There'll be plenty of time for questions, so please do start firing them off. If you fire them into the Q&A, my job is to ask as few questions as possible because I want you guys to do it. You are going to have far more interesting things to say than I do. But to have us begin a little bit, we know that housing is so much more than where you lay your head at night. And so, Claire, could I bring you in for a little bit of an idea of what it's like with so many of your students wanting to get the education they deserve, what it means for them to be in temporary accommodation and still trying to achieve an education?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm Claire, I'm Deputy Head at Anderton Park. Amazing school in Spark Hill, amazing children, amazing families. It's brilliant here. It's fantastic. Children love learning. It's great to see children thrive, and that is our main core purpose at Anderton Park, is to enable families to thrive. And that means so much more than learning. It means so much more than national curriculum, because for many of our families, life is tough. Like you said, we've got 45% of free school meals. It's more than double national average. That number is increasing daily. It has increased during the pandemic, and I'm expecting it to increase post-pandemic as well, because life is very hard for many of our families. We have a big pastoral team here. So there's myself as lead ESL and deputy head. We have 2 learning mentors, and we have a family support worker who speaks Romanian, because a lot of our families are from Romania and struggle with the language barrier. So we have that's a pretty big support team, and that is just to enable children to learn. So we invest heavily in our pastoral, because if children and families aren't in a place to be able to learn, then we know that they can't. So the psychology behind all of this is about cortisol. So cortisol is released in your body when there is fear involved, and we see this through the housing. The impact of housing has this effect on children. When you have cortisol, psychologists often say that cortisol kills learning, because you have this fear running through your body that you cannot then come to school and be in a position to learn. It just doesn't work. And we see that firsthand, which is why we have got such a massive pastoral team here, because unless children are in a place to learn, they can't learn. And the housing crisis for many of our families has exacerbated this. I did a little bit of adding up, and just in the past 8 months, we have 6 families who have been made homeless. Now, we're 2 form-entry school, so we are an average-sized primary school. There's nothing above average apart from our free school meals. The class sizes, this is average. So we've got 12 children in the past 10 months who have 8 to 10 months who have been made homeless. And when I say made homeless, I mean they have been moved into a travel lodge. Spark Hill is quite central, south central Birmingham. Many of our families, one of them was placed in a travel lodge in Nuneaton, one is in Wolverhampton, one family in Great Bar, in travel lodges. One was on the Hagley Road. Hagley Road sounds quite close, doesn't it, to Spark Hill, but actually that's 3 buses. And I can tell you that if you are moving into emergency housing, you probably haven't got a car, and you probably can't afford to run a car either. So it's not just the housing, it's everything else that goes with this. There is unfortunately quite a lot of domestic violence that our children experience as well. And when families are moved into refuges are often not in Birmingham, or in Birmingham somewhere else. So all of these things, it's not just about being moved, tick box, you have been moved into a hotel, you are safe, we have done our job. Because this has such an impact on our families and our children. And I've got a page of notes here that I'm reading from, and something that I've highlighted here, which comes straight from here in me, is this is not my Birmingham. This is not what I signed up for. I love being in Birmingham. I've lived here since I was 18. I came to university here and never left. I love it. But this does not make me feel proud to be an honorary Brummie. I feel like we can do so much better than this. And I just feel that we're letting our kids down. Birmingham and the West Midlands have got an opportunity to be trailblazers in this. When there is a housing crisis, we are in crisis. And when you are in crisis, you have an opportunity to do something about it. And I see firsthand the impact that it has on our children. Many of our families living in emergency accommodation, like I said, are living in travel lodges. During the pandemic, the kitchens were closed because of social distancing. So they closed the kitchens, so they had no opportunity to cook their own food. Now, when you talk about housing, you also talk about people's human rights and fundamental human rights. And families want to provide for each other and for their family. Parents want to provide for their children and their families. And taking away the opportunity to cook for your family takes away what a parent wants to do for their children. So they then had to eat from takeaways, which impacts on their actual health as well. They were cramped. 3 or 4 buses from school, don't drive. Now, if you're living in temporary accommodation, I would guess that you also can't afford to buy a bus fare. So we had many families who contacted school and asked for help. And this is where schools aren't just education givers. They are not just an education service, because of the lack of service from others, from the council. It's hard to ring the council. They come to school because they know that we're here. They know that we will help them. And so school, we have paid for bus passes. We paid for weekly bus passes for families so that children can have that normality, because that's what they crave and that's what they deserve. So yeah, I have seen our families be very resilient. They don't give up. They don't just say, well, I can't do it, I can't get here. They try their very best. They have not been made homeless out of choice. This has been, some of them have been in private rental accommodation that is substandard, and they are just given no notice by landlords. The lack of social housing then means that they stay in these temporary accommodations, this emergency accommodation in a hotel, and that they stay there for a very long period of time. So when I hear families who've spoken to the council and the council have advised them to make themselves homeless, I think, no, don't, because I know that this is going to be a really long, drawn out process, and I know that you will be in a travel lodge that is going to potentially be substandard with people sharing facilities. But it appears that that is the system, but the system doesn't work, in my opinion.
And we'll come back to that, Claire, especially of how the system may have changed over recent years in your time teaching. But Vicky, could I bring you in now and just get a little bit of an idea as to how Claire's experience is reflected across the broader area? I know that we have right now in the West Midlands, the number of homeless people have tripled in the last 5 years to over 16,000. But what does that mean in terms of the services you're providing in shelter in Birmingham and beyond?
Thank you, and Claire's really set the scene, really, in terms of what actually happens at the coalface, basically. So I also am a Brummie. I've lived here all my life, and I think over the last few years, if I can just set the scene on that, Alastair, what I've seen is more visible homelessness, street homelessness, which I think a lot of other people have seen. But what people don't see are the families who are in temporary accommodation. So within Birmingham, and then I think all the other sort of other Black Country local authorities follow behind. Currently within Birmingham, we've got 3,500 households who are homeless. A large percentage of those are families who are, as Claire was saying, finding themselves placed in temporary accommodation, be that bed and breakfast, or as Claire was talking about, hotel provision, or the council's provision. The problem with that is that people can't move. So the minimum sort of time period we're talking about is 2 years for people to be in temporary accommodation, and that could be moved from different temporary accommodation to different temporary accommodation because there are such pressures on the local authority in that respect. So there's a lot of challenges there. The reasons for homelessness as well, I think, which is quite important to look at. Before COVID, eviction from the private rented sector was the top reason, and I think that probably holds true for a lot of the other local authorities across the region, followed by domestic abuse. I think during COVID, it's friends and families who've asked people to leave the house, the home, and again, followed by domestic abuse. So again, huge challenges. We've had the eviction ban end. We are waiting to see a lot of evictions as a result of the eviction ban being lifted. And I'm sure, again, that's probably the case for a lot of the West Midlands. So in terms of our service and what we can offer, we've got complex needs services, but we've also got advice service offer that we offer to people. And those people coming to us are probably at that crisis point, not at the stage probably where we would like, where it's earlier in the journey, as it were, Alastair. But that being said, we can still help them. So a lot of people come to us with possession notices. Obviously, during COVID, those weren't lawful, but we were hearing where unlawful eviction was happening. You know, where a landlord, generally in the private rented sector, I'd have to say, were saying to people, you know, we're going to evict you. It's going to happen within a week, and people thinking that was the law, if you know what I mean. So we've got people that come to us for that kind of advice and knowing their housing rights, which I think is a real gap in people's knowledge. We also have people that come to us just to find out what their housing options are. So be that, you know, if they are going to be homeless, what can they look at? What are the opportunities? And again, it's quite limited, because again, for a lot of people, they're ending up in that temporary accommodation position, because there isn't the permanent accommodation, there isn't the permanent social housing. Probably about a year or so ago, for Birmingham, it's about 60,000 units of social housing that was available. Again, not sure for the other local authorities, because some of them haven't actually got their own stock anymore. But that limitation in terms of the number of units that the local authority has got means that, you know, there's not a ready supply of accommodation for people. In addition to that, we get quite a number of people that come to us that have got large families. So the accommodation that's available is probably smaller units. It's not the larger family units that people need. And also, I think there's a lack of support sometimes for people when they are entering into those issues. When I say a lack of, they might not know where to go for that support. So I think there's a number of things that are sort of swirling around really in terms of the impacts. And if I can just add to what Claire was talking about, we previously ran a family support service, and we were finding, and it was heart-wrenching, the fact that there were a number of children that were having mental health problems, you know, behavioural problems, self-harm, depression, all sorts of different things. And we were faced with having to refer them into Forward Thinking Birmingham, which is like a mental health support service for children from birth up to the age of 25. And these services can't cope with the level of pressure that is coming. Yeah. And that was then. So I can only imagine with COVID and all these other sort of challenges that are out there, that is growing. So I'll be quiet now, because let Shaun come in terms of...
Well, it'd be good to bring Shaun in, just to give... Shaun, if you could bring your view from what you see in your constituency of West Bromwich, because we've heard quite movingly from both Claire and Vicky the situation they see on the ground. If you're able to share what you see as a constituency MP, but also I'm keen for us to, we see the nature of the impact. I'd be keen for us to both explore how that's come about, but then move us into what the solutions could be. So it might also be instructive to hear a little bit of your own personal experiences of housing as you were growing up.
No, absolutely, Alastair, and thank you for that. I think, so coming at this from sort of two examples, as a constituency MP, just to set the scene from my perspective. So in my constituency, 30% of people live in social rented accommodation, which is well over the national average. I think it's 11% over the national average for most areas, and we're the 14th most deprived borough in the country, just to set the scene in terms of the challenges that we deal with there. So as you can imagine, from a constituency casework perspective, social housing is, I think we estimated 85% of the work I deal with. Now, the bulk of that predominantly is the quality of existing stock. And what we see from that is then the impact that trickles through. So quite often I will have a constituent contact me who is concerned, say something about mold, repairs, whatever, but they're then talking to me about the impact that's having on their own physical health, and not just their own physical health, but the well-being of their children as well. Their children don't want to go to school, they feel demotivated, they're just general feeling of being unhappy because they're just not in that safe and secure environment. And we know the correlation that there is between, and probably Claire knows it better than me, between educational attainment and a secure home space, and having that secure home space from the start of your life. So the biggest thing I found, sort of coming in as a relatively newbie constituency MP, is that in a constituency with such a reliance on social housing, the importance of getting the existing sort of stock right and the quality of homes. I think that's the real big thing, because when we frame this debate, we look at the numbers built. That's great, but quite often what we forget to talk about is the quality of those homes. What should those homes look like? How do we ensure that they don't just tick a box, tick a quota, but actually develop a society that they're moving forward? You've got a happy, healthy, younger generation. You've got people that can move forward. We ensure that the construction and the building of these homes encourages new jobs, new skills, and revitalising communities, because that's the big thing. Certainly the stigma I have to push it back against when we're talking about building new homes is, particularly social rent, is, well, is it not going to bring down our community? No, not if it's done in the right way. And I think that's the big thing. You asked the question about what has been the sort of some of the things that have brought these challenges on. And I definitely think at the heart of that is a resource issue. I think it's in Sandwell, we do have a scenario where the council still retain quite a large majority of the social housing stock. But of course, the local authorities have about 5 million other things they've got to do as well, and very capped resources. COVID hasn't helped. I think from a building perspective, the one thing I would say is that some local authorities have got a little bit sloppy with their local plans. So these are the plans that they use to decide on development. If these, I've got some authorities that are 10 years out of date. The problem with that is that when you're then trying to decide your housing allocation, if your local plan's not sorted, you can't decide your housing allocation. So how on earth are we meant to actually know exactly what we need for the communities we're in, which is quite often the case then when we're getting a lot of these backlogs coming through. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's one there. And I think just to sort of say as well, I mentioned the pandemic then. Interestingly, in the West Midlands, obviously everyone remembers the Everyone In scheme, and Vicky made a really good point about street homelessness. Everyone In was really interesting because we saw that as an example of when different stakeholders come together, what can be achieved. And I think in the West Midlands, it was something like a 90% rate of getting people off the street and into some form of accommodation. And that was a partnership with the local authorities and the West Midlands Combined Authority and the Homelessness Task Force that actually saw what we could achieve through that. And actually, I think the Homelessness Task Force in the West Midlands, we're very fortunate to have that, because I certainly know from the conversations I've had, not just with the mayor, but with people that are there as well, is that the focus of that task force isn't just about getting people off the street, ticking boxes. It's the next stage of that as well. And there's some really powerful advocates in that team who talk about the importance. And I think it's something, again, that we've framed this discussion throughout, the auxiliary needs that surround this housing debate: skills, education, health, fighting back against inequalities, fighting back against ingrained prejudice, ensuring that everyone can access these absolutely vital social community assets, and ensuring that ultimately these remain social assets, which you might find, you might think a Tory MP turning around talking about social community assets, you might think, what? But I am a fervent believer that you can have this property-only democracy that is engaged with us, but you can still have a strong social rent sector as well. And from my own personal perspective, so I was brought up in social housing, as you mentioned at the start, Alastair. I saw how important that was. Now, that didn't stop. I would say that, linking to the point I've just made, that doesn't stop the ambition to want to be part of that home-owning, being a homer. But actually, what it taught me and what I've learned as a member of parliament in my patch, a lot of people want the security of living in social housing because they know where they stand, and particularly the vulnerable people, the most vulnerable in society, who need that and who need the additional support that comes with that. They don't want to be just, they're not necessarily looking to buy, they need that support there. And I think for me, that's been the biggest thing. So we can balance these two. And I often say this to colleagues, in my party in particular, is, there's nothing anti-conservative about wanting good social housing. Harold Macmillan in the 50s championed this like you wouldn't believe. This is, the 13 years of you never had it so good. At the core of that was a Tory government talking about social housing and building new homes. And I think as a party, just to get on my party political broadcast, we need to get back to that, because I think we've forgotten to talk about that over the last 40 years. So, sorry, I've touched on a lot of issues there, so I appreciate it, but I just thought I'd sort of cap off my comments there, really.
No, it's really interesting. It's amazing to me as sort of a civil society outsider of all the party traditions, how easy it is to find new narratives around you. Everyone knows about Right to Buy and connected to Margaret Thatcher, but so few people know about Harold Macmillan and how he built so much of the social housing stock. Just to explain, Claire is obviously actually in her school being a deputy head, and her priority is rightly that, not us lot. So she just had to nip off and take care of something there. But thank you so much for coming back, Claire, because what we were just discussing there is some of the realities of the situation we're in. It would be useful, and we've got a few questions come in asking how things have changed in recent years and what have been the driving forces for them. Olivia Dunphy asks particularly, what have been some of the most visible impacts that you see in children that have been made homeless or in bad housing? And then also building on what Shaun was saying, how can we all work together to help you? What are the things that Shelter, but also the council and the combined authority be doing to better help you help those children in that situation?
Yeah, great question. And it's interesting because as you all know, children are different. Every child is different. Some children react behaviourally, they act aggressively. Some children you would never even know that this is happening to them, and this is what is so awful about it, is because you don't always know. And there have been some times when we have found out retrospectively that this has happened to a family and we didn't even know, because the children didn't show any signs that they were agitated, upset. Nothing came out, and you just think, my gosh, children are so resilient. But at the same time, they are resilient, but they shouldn't have to deal with things like that. And often children just carry on because for some of our children, they don't know any other way, and they don't know anything different. They don't know what a property looks like that hasn't got mold on the walls, because they've only ever lived in a property that's got mold on the wall. So our children on the whole are absolutely amazing at just carrying on, but that's not necessarily the right thing to do. We know from our emotion coaching that it is so important to understand those feelings, and that it's normal and natural to feel tired when you've had to get 3 buses and then we're expecting you to write for 45 minutes or answer really hard maths equations. So children display a range of emotions, or some of them don't want to talk about it at all. We've had one family in particular. The children came in and they were mortified that school knew that they were living in a Travelodge, because they want to come to school and just be like everybody else. They don't want anybody to know that anything is going on in their life. And sometimes children, they do this, they put up their barriers, and families do as well. So I think one of the questions was, how do families talk to us? How do they know? Sometimes they just come and say this has happened. Sometimes we find out retrospectively, or sometimes we have worked it out because something has happened to the children at school. So in terms of what shelter or what everybody can do to help, and Vicky touched on this with Forward Thinking Birmingham, again, resources are very stretched. And my experience as a designated lead DSL, which is designated safeguarding leader, so I'm responsible for safeguarding needs in school, is that unless you are on the edge of dying or being harmed that night, nothing will happen. And I'm not trying to be dramatic. This is just what we're experiencing at school. So you can make a referral to Forward Thinking Birmingham, you can make a referral to Children's Trust, but if you are in a Travelodge, in emergency accommodation, you are not deemed high risk because you've got somewhere to stay. And that just is, it's a measure of how stretched everything is in Birmingham and how stretched all the services are in Birmingham. Everybody wants to help, but there just aren't enough people to help. So things like an educational psychologist, you know, if there was funds available and there could be a helpline, an ed psych could be on the end of a phone that schools could ring and children could talk or have a conversation with an ed psych, things like that. Services that we can't access because they are so stretched in Birmingham need to be picked up by somebody else. So that would be one way to help.
Can I just add to that, Claire?
Yeah, please come in, Vicky.
Because I agree completely with what Claire said, and there's no consistency. So I was a governor at a school in King's Standing and similar sort of issues. And what I could see, Claire, is some of those children under the age of 11 are on that sort of journey towards street homelessness. Not all of them, but street homelessness. And some of them had been in temporary accommodation or had been in a household where there was domestic abuse. All sorts of different things that were going on. And what I found quite harrowing talking to the deputy head in that school was they were trying their best to put as much resource in, but the worry was when they got to secondary school, there was a feeling that they would just disappear out of the system. And I think there is something around that cradle to the grave kind of approach that we need to look at it, you know, the system as a whole, not just elements of it, because they're also interconnected. but I think the way the system is at the moment, it's quite siloed. So if you are in one part and you're supported, but you might dip out of another bit and come up at another place, it's how those different parts of the system are supporting you. And there's some evidence, I think, around secondary school children who are going out of secondary schools but coming into criminal justice. We need to pull all of these different pieces together. So sorry, that was just, I wanted to just add to what Claire had talked about.
No, that's really helpful, Vicky. And something that struck me, this talk and this series is built upon some work we did last month that is all connected in a report you can see called Fight for Home. And that looked at the different way that the housing emergency exists and how it impacts people in different ways, as you say. And one of those things that struck me is when you look at the top 10 political issues of the public, housing's usually in the top 10, but lower down. But many of the issues that are higher than it struck me, come from a result of inadequate housing and unaffordable housing. People in food poverty because they're choosing between rent or food, and the way these things interconnect. And Shaun, if I could bring you in, how do we change the political mindset to understand how these things are connected and how the stability of housing can come out of it? And a question we had from Grace Clark is, what would you say is the solution to this housing crisis, and how do you think it can start to be implemented?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't
fix everything, Shaun, in a soundbite.
Sort it out, Shaun. I don't think there's one solution is the first thing that I would say. I think it's an interconnected level of solution. So I think first of all, it's the model that we operate for delivery of social housing. I think that's, is it effective to have that driven solely by local authorities, or is there a way we can do that on a more regional level? What's the approach that we should be taking there? And obviously, if we're asking authorities to deliver that, then another question arises in terms of what other support do they need to be given. Does the authority need to be given to be able to provide then to the service users on the front line? It's not just well and good about saying to an organisation or an authority, right, how's someone, we've got to frame that debate around the additional needs that you've just talked about there, Alastair, things like health and education and skills and all the other things that intertwine within that. I think it's also the age-old issue in Whitehall, perhaps, of actually getting departments to talk to each other, because they just don't do it. And I've been here 18 months and have banged my head against a brick wall the amount of times that I've found that government departments who are probably working on parallel projects that actually, if they came together, could actually solve a problem, just are totally siloed. And I think that's the biggest thing, really, and I'm probably controversial opinion here, but until we take a sledgehammer to the structure in Whitehall as it is and absolutely rip it down and start again, these problems are just going to persist and persist and persist and persist. So really, it's about an effective delivery model that doesn't just look at the bricks and mortar, but looks at all the ancillary issues around it. It's about making sure that actually the structures that we have there for delivery work effectively and actually encompass those additional needs that we talk about. And it's ensuring that policymakers, decision makers, and deliverers of these support mechanisms are not operating in silo and are actually working together and talking together. The housing providers with schools, with local authorities, with social services. And where that happens, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does happen in certain areas. Where that happens, it works really well, but it's getting that to become more uniform and getting that to become the norm, not the exception. I think if we can do that, it's not going to be the quick fix, but we're well on the way to really changing how we view our social housing strategy, and obviously resolving some of the issues that you've highlighted there.
I was just going to add to that, Shaun. I think it might be like having some sort of regional assembly or something where different parts of, different parts of sector or what have you come together to have that kind of conversation and to look at the journey that families are on, because a family does not just have homelessness, they have debt, they have arrears, they have all sorts of different things. And I just think that there is an opportunity maybe for all of the sectors to come together to have that discussion about how we start building up a good framework around that.
No, I'd agree with that completely, Vicky. In fairness, I'd agree. There's got to be some sort of way we can pull those groups together to initiate those conversations, and equally to marry up the work that, say, the Department of Work and Pensions is doing on tackling debt with what MHCLG is doing on its housing supply issues. And I think there's a way to do that. And I would also say as well, actually, that perhaps we've got these metro mayors beefing up their spatial planning powers so they can actually take the lead on developing and building the social housing. Because in the West Midlands, our mayor doesn't have spatial planning at the moment. They've been able to do that. I think you'd see a difference.
And just a point you made before, Shaun, sorry, Alastair, about local plans, probably showing my age, back in like the mid-90s, we used to do housing needs surveys. I'm not quite sure that local authorities are doing them, or to the extent that they used to do them. And that really looked at that sort of local need and married that up with the local plan. I don't know whether there's an opportunity to look at housing needs surveys or whatever the new title of it is, but make sure that that's part of, that's consistently done by local authorities. Sorry, Alastair, I jumped in on what you were going to say.
No, that's helpful. But Shaun, is there a question of gravity here in terms of that will always succumb to it? Vicky said earlier, I think it was 60,000 social homes available to Birmingham. We know from the research we've done, there's 1 million people in the West Midlands who right now are afraid they'll never find a stable home. In the end, until we unlock that supply of social housing and get the children out of the travel lodges as a result of that, we're still going to be trying to spin too many plates. But that isn't the political narrative at the moment. People are not pointing to social housing as an obvious gap of need in this country, which is on shelter, and all of us involved who know that to be the case, to be louder and clearer about that. But what is your advice in terms of how we change that political narrative and understanding of social housing?
Well, that's a really good question, Alastair. And I think to answer it, to start with, we need to sort of identify what the narrative is. And the narrative at the moment is all about ownership. That's what it's coming down to, isn't it? That's when we talk about affordable housing, it's ownership. I think to do that, I think there's a broader debate as so it's the point I touched on before, which was, I think there is a bit of a fear that if you talk about social housing and you advocate for it, you're somehow anti-home ownership, which is not the case at all. And I think the first sort of block that we've got to get over is to get rid of that narrative that says that if you advocate social housing, that you advocate more social rent properties, that for some reason you're then trying to stifle people from purchasing their home, which is just simply not true. I think going forward from that, then logistically, it's all about building and build, basically. That's, as the Prime Minister said at the tail end of last year, build. He was on about it quite a lot, and he's not wrong. Now, in the West Midlands, we're obviously very fortunate that we've got quite a lot of brownfield industrial land. We've got quite a lot of investment coming in as a result of infrastructure projects that are going ahead. Hopefully, if it comes off things like HS2, the metro that's being expanded, things like that, that present opportunities to ensure that we can actually build new communities off the back of that investment, and ensure that our housing supply, our social rent housing supply, is there and it is adequate. But I also, again, come back to the point I made at the start. It's quality over quantity. This is the biggest thing as a constituency MP I pick up, and the reason I'm going on about it is because I get it all the time. It is so important that the quality of the homes that we build are fit to be a secure and stable home. I was very fortunate, saying the house I grew up in, it was, but there are many, and I could show you my case bag where it's just not the case. And I think, as I say, we've really got to ensure that we don't allow this temptation of sort of smash and grab of like, okay, we'll hit a quota, so let's just build all these houses, but we won't necessarily do the real detailed work to ensure that 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years down the line, we're not going to suddenly find we've got inherent issues which make these really just not the place you want to live. And I think ultimately what it comes back to as well, is community at the heart of it. What makes a community today? In the Black Country, and Vicky, you'll know this from your work in the Black Country. Community still is very much ingrained in the people that live there. For many people, I represent 3 towns, right? I know my seat's West Bromwich West, but reality it's Wednesbury, Tipton, Albury, right? Most people in those towns live and work in the same town. They don't go outside of it. They stay where they are, you know, and so they've probably lived in the same house for 2 or 3 generations. You know, a lot of the business people have run their businesses for 5 or 6 generations. Everyone knows everyone. It is those type of communities. So what we've got to do is take the inspiration from that. And when we think about building social housing, we're not just thinking about building social housing, we're thinking about building communities that will thrive and will grow, that will see jobs come in, that will see skills come in, that will ultimately see people want to stay there. I mean, if I can, I remember last year in one of my schools asking the upper sixth, saying, how many of you are going to stay here or come back here once you've done whatever it is you're going to do? 2 of them put their hand up out of a class of 30. That's the problem we've got to deal with. That's the issue that is part of this ultimately that we've got to resolve, which is, yes, getting people off the streets, yes, ensuring that we tackle all those endemic issues we've talked about that result from homelessness in an unstable home, but ultimately building communities that people want to live in and they want to work in and they want to build a life in. Because I think for too long, it's all been about that M25 corridor and saying to people that it's absolutely, you know, you grow up here, but then you clear off and you don't come back. And actually saying to people, no, you work here, you stay here, you build your life here. And I think if we get the social housing side of things right, you know, I think that's how we do it. I really do. I think that is the way in which we can really build the foundation to these communities.
And Claire, I want to bring you in because you're keen to come in, but I also wanted to ask you about that specifically, how you build a community. I'm sure your school has a community, but how do you retain it and keep it with the reality when children are in the crisis of temporary accommodation?
Yeah, and this is something I wanted to add on from what Shaun was saying, that we talk a lot about social housing, but we don't often talk a lot about private rental housing, and there is a place for private rental housing, especially where we are here. So we are in a Victorian school, so our school is 125 years this year. Happy birthday to us. And so we have rows and rows and rows of terraced houses. So it's a really densely populated area. The issues with that is that they're not social housing, but they're private rental housing. Now, that kind of opens up a whole new can of worms then, because a lot of what we experience and why families are made homeless are the standard of the private rental accommodation, and also the landlords that they have who possibly are registered, who don't keep the repairs up on the properties, who charge an extortionate amount for a 1-bedroom flat. £800 I think was the most recent one for a 1-bedroom flat where we had five children living in it. Now the family in there do not have recourse to public funds, but they don't necessarily want to move into social housing. They're happy to be privately renting, but if the standards of the private properties are maintained. So that's kind of a whole new raft of issues. And we have in our pastoral team, we have our own we ask parents to bring in their letting agreements so we can read through them, see what their entitlements are. Now, this is not anything to do with education, but because there isn't anybody else doing that, it falls on the people who are the frontline workers, and we are classed as those frontline workers there because we are in a building every single day and families know that we're here and we will help them because it helps the children. So I just want to also make us think about this is not just social housing. We've got an issue here with private rental.
Shaun in on that, actually. Shaun, that is a question we've been asked by the audience, is that there is something to be said for improving private tenants' rights here, ensuring landlords are properly regulated, monitored. The Renters Reform Bill's coming. What do you want to see that do? And how can it help take the burden off teachers like Claire who want to be teaching, not inspecting rental contracts?
So I think so. Again, a really good point, and I think again what Claire's touched on there is a lot around these ancillary issues that we all encounter and deal with, and is absolutely right to raise them. I think firstly what I would say is that certainly from the conversations I've had with the Department for Communities Local Government, I think it's clear that there does need to be private sector reform. I think clearly it's a difficult one. I think we've got to ensure that whatever comes out of that, and I'm not trying to preempt whatever that looks like, there's got to be protection for the most vulnerable tenants that are there, basically. And it's got to, we need to ensure that we don't have situations where, as I say, Claire and her colleagues are having to sort of check through rental agreements and ensure, you know, people have got those rights there. But actually, I think the main thing that I would say, for again, picking up from my casework, is that I suppose tenants have their rights communicated to them in the clearest way possible as part of that process. I think that's the biggest thing I think needs to be seen, because I think that is probably the problem that we've got. And I think if there's a way we can enshrine that a bit more to make it clearer that, you know, there is an obligation there to ensure you know what you're going into, which is you know, let's face it, you know, I come from actually a legal background myself. I mean, you know, the fact is that you would never sign a commercial contract without knowing what the situation was before you do it. And I don't see why then there can't be a way that we use whatever powers we've got from a legislative point of view to ensure that tenants have that communicated to them in the clearest way possible. And I think that's the biggest thing, so that we can ensure then that tenants get that tenants have that opportunity to know where they stand, and they're not going to get you know, we're not going to see the issues that we see, and that certainly I pick up in my case bag. So I think for me, that's probably the biggest thing that I'd want to see.
I think as well, Shaun, it's worth noting that sometimes we can be very victim led, and we look at victims. So the victims, in my opinion, this one would be the tenants, and actually not looking at the root of the problem, which is the landlords. And it's the landlords who often, in what we found here, that they acknowledge that a repair needs doing, but just don't do it, and say, well, move out then. If it's not, you know, move out, find somewhere else. And there isn't that opportunity for families to just do that, because they don't want to move anywhere else, because if they try to look for somewhere else, they'd have to find somewhere that was far from school. So it's not just, it is, you're absolutely right, it is empowering tenants to know what their rights are, but it's also holding landlords to account when they are not making those repairs.
Which is why it's so important, as the government's committed to, that we get rid of Section 21, no fault eviction, because that's the challenge we face, is that when tenants are nervous to call for repairs because they know they could face that eviction notice on the doormat. I'm conscious of time, and as we get into the last section, I want us to be able to look at all our roles in solutions. But before I do that, there's just a question I want to put to you, Vicky, that came from Jagwant Johal in the Birmingham Race Impact Group. He's asked that how can the Building Back Better agenda work for meeting the housing needs of especially Black, Asian and other minoritized communities? And how can we factor out the reality that we've seen in shelter zone research of that those groups are more likely to be in the housing emergency than people from a white background? What is the way that we can help these communities to truly benefit from the opportunity of Building Back Better?
I think Shaun touched on it earlier, actually, about how we talk to communities. So some of the work we're looking at, we recognise there is such a demand out there in terms of what people need to know about their housing rights and what have you, and that we're not able to meet all of that need that's out there. I think there's something about looking at what those key issues are, what a lot of those people are facing, and some of those we know. But I think it's about also engaging within those local communities themselves to find out actually what's happening for them, and looking at how we can make that bridge, basically. So finding out what those issues are and linking that back into those local authority structures, which are or can feel for some people quite limiting for people, you know, in terms of getting in touch. But once we know what those issues are, that we can actually then start working at that local level in terms of what the need is, what is actually required, and build up those plans with those local people. So I see our role as being a bit of a, probably sounds quite grand, but a bit of a catalyst to bring those different parts together. Claire's part of a piece of work at the moment, actually, where we're talking to people within communities, including people in community organisations, schools and what have you, about what they see as some of those key issues are, bringing that information together so we can start working on that and actually working with local authorities so that they're not in a vacuum thinking, oh, this is what we think is happening. This is what people are actually saying. And I think that's where we can amplify the voice. I'm not saying people haven't got a voice, but amplify the voice of some of those marginalised communities, be that people from BAME communities or other communities that have felt quite, disenfranchised basically by the systems that are in place.
And Shaun, can I bring you in there? It's not just it's about understanding that particular groups are especially vulnerable and have been disadvantaged over time. Research that we've done has shown it comes across in different ways. If you're disabled, you're more likely to face bad housing. If you're from an LGBT background, you're more likely to. And I just wondered, is there some way in which you can challenge that idea that this is slightly the point of talking to you all from the West Midlands, is that different areas and different communities face things in different ways. And while we need a big national solution of investment is clearly in the sort of housing that's needed, but how do you get from that macro, we just need to sort stuff from the top and let it filter down, but how do you still engage with communities and people from different particular experiences and backgrounds in a way that makes them feel the opportunity is there for them as well?
So I'm probably going to sound really repetitive here, but I think it comes back down to delivery again, and the delivery models that you use, because I think ultimately they've got to be the catalyst for the really effective community engagement. I think it's ensuring that those, whatever that delivery model looks like, it's got the resource. So we've got to talk, obviously still the investment and the macro side of it is still important, but it's got the resource to do what it needs to do, but actually as well, it is as connected to those groups as it needs to be. So in other words, it's on the ground, having those conversations and understanding those, the different people and how they're impacted. So that's ensuring that within the sector more broadly, we're as diverse and as open as possible, that, that when those conversations are happening, they're happening with people that can empathise with those situations as well, and ensuring that actually we create this all sort of organic narrative whereby, people that have those experiences of social housing are the ones also involved in the delivery of it, and we encourage people in there who understand those experiences, because if you're speaking to someone that's been in the same situation as you, you're more likely to respond, you're more likely to actually take up that help, but actually more importantly, I think you're both more likely going to be able to navigate a solution that's going to ensure that we don't lock people out. So it's about really ensuring that, yes, the headline money's there, we can't forget that, we need that, but then we really develop an effective delivery strategy that is community led, that is focused on those service users, and ultimately ensures that we're not locking people out, because you automatically generate that inclusivity as a result of a locally led and effective delivery strategy.
Brilliant. I'm going to do just one last round of you all, just to bring out some final points. And Claire, if I could start with you. I'd love to make you Prime Minister, so let's pretend that I have that power too right now. You don't have to isolate, don't worry, although Chequers might be a nice place to if you have to. What would you do? What would be the first thing on the menu of dealing with the housing emergency that's affecting the West Midlands?
Wow, what a question! And you didn't preempt me on this one.
Sorry, yes, it's very
right on the spot on it. Do you know what? I haven't thought about being Prime Minister, but thanks so much. And it's interesting when Shaun was talking then about all the services that are available, and when you were talking about those from a minority background. I've only ever worked in Sparkhill, and Sparkhill is predominantly Muslim Asian. It's all I know. It's all I've worked with the children, and I see families who don't speak English learning English, but I also see the barriers that our country puts up for those children, for those families. So to register with a DWP, as Shaun was mentioning, a DWP, you have to have it's all done online, so you have to have Wi-Fi, you've got to have an email address, you've got to have data on your phone, you've got to have this, that and the other, you've got to have a national insurance number. Many of our families don't have that, especially if they're newly arrived from other countries. They want to come here to work. They don't want to come here to accept social housing. They want to come here to work, and sometimes they find themselves in these situations. So if I could do anything, I would get the community feel that we all have, and I would want that to be across the whole of the UK, which I know sounds a bit simplistic, but people need to feel welcome in our country, and people need to feel that they belong and that there is a place for them here, because the children who are currently in our school are the future. They're our future. These will be the children who are making decisions. They'll be the adults making decisions when we're all old and retired. And I want to make sure that they have an excellent education so that they're able to make decisions on behalf of us and for the rest of our country. for the future of our country, because that's what they are. Now, I don't feel currently our system enables these families to thrive, and that is my measure. If a family isn't thriving, then we need to do something about it. So in answer to your question, I haven't answered your question at all, which maybe makes me a great Prime Minister. But I would just really want us to think about what it's like for every single child in this country, no matter what background they come from, and that everything that we do enables them to thrive and become excellent humans.
Fantastic, thank you, Claire. Vicky, can I bring you in and ask you, how can we help achieve that as Shelter, and what are we already doing to campaign on these issues and our work to support families? Just to end with a bit of optimism about how people can join this fight with us.
So, as I mentioned earlier, I think it is about how we can work with communities. So we're looking through the work we're doing with our community organiser about how we can bring more people on board, so we can campaign more for what's actually needed. But can I just add as well, I think, Alastair, that we've got, I think as an organisation, an opportunity here to bring together lots of different organisations and partnerships. So be that statutory, third sector, the private sector, to bring them together with government to actually raise the roof basically in terms of what's needed. So I do think that there's something we can do there. And if I was Prime Minister, because you didn't ask me that, if we could make the system much more simple, I think it's just too difficult. So that's my
Fantastic. Shaun, could I bring you in for the last word? How can we best give politicians the space to achieve that? How can we make it political issue number one? How can our campaigns cut through so you are able to slam down on the minister's desk? There's no more avoiding this. This is what needs to be done. We need to invest in the social housing. We need to make every child matter. We do that by making these services as simple as possible, as Claire and Vicky have said. We know we're competing with 20 other things, that many of which are equally as important in different ways. You know, we know we need to tackle net zero. We know that things like international development matter, but this matters as well. So how do we make sure this has time in terms of being prioritised by politicians?
Again, I think that's a brilliant question, and I think, to be honest, what it's about is framing the argument around investment and seeing this as something that government will see that return on. I think that's the big thing that I've learned from being here over the last 18 months, is that when you're pitching this stuff, it's about, well, what return is the government going to see from this? And they're going to see an uptick in skills, employment, the opportunities that come in terms of regional growth and development, you know, the opportunities that come in more community cohesion. You know, ultimately, unfortunately, Whitehall as it is at the moment is still very spreadsheet numbers led. So it's framing that narrative, and this is the uptick you're going to see. If you were to ask me what I was going to do if I was Prime Minister, and I think you guys probably got more chance of that, of becoming that, than I do, I would probably say that the solutions are definitely there. If it was me, I would take a whole sledgehammer to the system that's currently in place, because I think the solutions are there. It's just the system that's causing the blockage. I'd rip it down and start again, which probably strikes absolute fear into some of my colleagues, but hey ho, who cares? I think at the end of the day, that's the only way we're going to achieve reform sometimes, is being a little bit fearless and just cracking on. And it's about, actually, it was Andy Street that says to me, it's about delivery, not politics. It's about ensuring that whatever it is, it's about being fearless in that delivery. And I think that's the big thing that we've got to do. So I think ultimately, within the framework that we're in right now, it's about showing that tangible return and framing it like that. Government will see a tangible return, but I think more broadly, I think we've got to smash the Smith system to pieces and start again.
Glorious way to conclude. Thank you, Shaun. It's good to see, whether we're school teachers, hub managers or MPs, we're all very enthusiastic about smashing the system. Thank you so much for your time, and especially to those who've sat with their video open and watched and asked questions to this. Thank you so much to Shaun Bailey, MP for West Bromwich West. Thank you so much to Vicky Hines, our hub manager in Birmingham. Thanks to Claire Evans, Deputy Head at Anderton Park Primary. I hope everyone will be able to join. We're doing this again tomorrow morning, and we've got a whole bunch of interesting people there from Greater London giving their view. We've got Penny Walster, the London hub manager there, Vicky's peer. We have Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor for Housing will be joining us. And we have Daisy May Hudson, who is a brilliant documentary filmmaker, but who has made an amazing documentary for us on temporary accommodation, what it means, an experience of housing that she has experienced directly herself. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. And I hope that by seeing these different parts of the country, we're able to see the national story, both of what's going wrong, but also what we can fight together to make right. So thank you so much, everybody.